Hi, boys and girls. I'm here with your Wednesday night lesson, and this is a really exciting lesson. For some of you, it's familiar, and for others, this might be one of the first times that you're hearing this story. But it is going to be in Exodus, like we've been in Exodus. We're going to start in chapter 7, and we're going to go through most of chapter 10. So instead of reading it from the Bible, I've got my Bible here as a reference, but I'm just going to tell you the story to make it go a little faster. But I encourage you, boys and girls, to open up your Bibles to Exodus. Remember, Exodus is the second book of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus. So it's kind of at the beginning of the Bible. So open up to Exodus 7, and here we go. If you remember from our last few times together on these videos, we've been talking about Moses. We talked about him being born and how he grew up in the palace of Pharaoh, but then he had to flee to Midian because Pharaoh wanted to kill him. He flees. He's there in Midian. God prepares him, and then God issues a challenge to him. Actually, he gives him purpose and a reason to go back to Egypt, and he calls him to do something amazing and big. He wants Moses to go back and talk to Pharaoh about releasing the Israelites out of slavery and bondage and to lead them into the promised land. That is a big job, and God knows that Moses is going to be able to do it with God's help. And so Moses at first didn't really want to, but he says yes. And now here we are at the beginning of today's story. So Moses and Aaron, his brother, go to Pharaoh, and they tell him, God says, let my people, the Israelites, go into the wilderness and worship me. Well, Pharaoh just laughs at him and says, no, I don't even know your God. And no, I'm not on board with that. I'm not going to let my slaves go. They're doing all the work. Why would I let them go? I don't know your God. No, that's not happening. Well, Pharaoh doesn't like it that Moses has asked this question. And so he makes life for the Israelites even harder. And the Israelites had already been slaves for 400 years at this point. And they had already been, required to make mud bricks. And some of the ingredients of mud bricks is straw. It goes in there, it helps it to stay strong and keeps the brick together and really a strong brick. Well, all this time, Pharaoh had been supplying all of the things that they needed to do this. And then, because Moses went and told Pharaoh what God said, Pharaoh became very irritated with him and said, you know what? I'm not even going to give you all the supplies that you need. Just go and make mud bricks and be gone. Well, the Israelites didn't have the supplies they needed, so this became very challenging. They would have to go gather their own straw to make the bricks, because if they didn't have that ingredient, then the bricks weren't very strong. And so it didn't make for solid, strong bricks. Well, there's no way that they could do what they were asked to do, to go find the straw, make the bricks, and do all the work in the time frame that they had. So they were starting to not do as good a job as they had been doing before. And so the Egyptians took it out on them and beat them whenever they couldn't do what they were supposed to do. Well, it looked on the surface like Moses had just messed everything up. And some of the Israelite leaders, they went to Pharaoh and said, please don't do this. Change your mind. And he would not. He said, be gone and go make bricks and do it without the supplies. At first, it might have looked like Moses had messed everything up, but God had a plan, and all of this was a part of it. And so the Israelites, though, were mad at Moses at first, and they didn't know what God's plan was, and they didn't know how exactly that would fit in. But Moses went. He went before Pharaoh, and God had told him what to say and had given him the instructions. So Moses goes back to Pharaoh, and he says, let my people go. But Pharaoh ignored him. And so, because of that, God caused there to be a lot of plagues over Egypt. Moses told Pharaoh each time, this is what's going to happen if you don't listen to God and let the Israelites go and worship God in the wilderness. This is what's going to happen. And Pharaoh each time just said no. So the first time, Aaron raises his staff over the Nile River and all of the water turned to blood. Even all of the water in the containers in all of Egypt turned to blood too, so that the Egyptians had no drinking water. And this caused a big problem because they would have not been able to meet their basic needs. And so that's the first plague, was that the water turned into blood. After about a week, God told Moses to go back to Pharaoh and to say it again, let my people go, or I will send a plague of frogs this time. And there will be frogs up out of the river and in your pots and your pans and even in your beds. There's going to be frogs everywhere. Can you imagine that many frogs everywhere? But Pharaoh wouldn't let the people go. And so Aaron raised his staff, and soon frogs filled every room and every house in Egypt. And so after a while, Pharaoh did say, he called to Moses and he begged him to make the frogs go away. There were so many frogs, they were dying and stinking everywhere, and it was causing a big problem. So Moses prayed and the frogs went away. But as soon as they went away, Pharaoh changed his mind and decided to keep his slaves and said, no, just kidding, it's good, we're good. And Moses went to Pharaoh again and said, let my people go, because the next plague that's coming is a plague of gnats. Now, have you ever seen a gnat? They're those little tiny bugs and they swarm around, and they're out really a lot of times in the summertime, and they're just really annoying. You have to get them away from your face. Well, Pharaoh wouldn't listen. And so here come swarms, millions and zillions and gazillions of gnats everywhere. Could you imagine? It was probably like clouds all around them. And they covered all the people and the animals, and it was just a bad situation. And the next day, Moses said to Pharaoh, God says to let his people go, or the next plague that's coming will be flies. But this time, God is going to protect his own people in the land of Goshen where they live, where the Israelites lived. And there will be no flies in the land of Goshen where they live. And do you think he said yes or no? Pharaoh said no. And so God did just as he said he was going to do. And thick layers of flies covered the palace and all of Egypt. There were no flies in the land of Goshen, but there were flies everywhere else. Well, before too long, Pharaoh called back to Moses and he said, all right, go worship your God, but do it right here in this land. Moses said no, because he knew that God was not a God of partial obedience. God wanted our full devotion and our full obedience. And so Moses knew that this would not be okay. He said, we must go into the wilderness as God commands. All right, Pharaoh said, I'll let you go tomorrow. Just make these flies go away now. But again, once the flies were gone, Pharaoh changed his mind again, and he refused to let God's people go. And so Moses went to Pharaoh again, and he said, let my people go. And he said, if you don't let God's people go worship him, a plague will strike your cattle and sheep. But none of the cattle and sheep in the land of Goshen will die. Pharaoh ignored Moses again. But sure enough, the next morning, the cattle and the sheep that belonged to the Egyptians got sick and died. The animals in the land of Goshen stayed strong and healthy. But Pharaoh still did not let God's people go. He was stubborn. God had turned his heart and made it hardened to this. And this was all part of God's plan. So the next plague that came was painful sores that broke out on all the Egyptians, including Pharaoh and his officials. Have you ever had a really bad sore? Maybe you got bit by an ant, or maybe you got bit by a some kind of spider or something. It caused a big sore. Well, imagine that, but it was much, much worse, and everybody had them of the Egyptians, but still Pharaoh would not let his people go. So Moses warned Pharaoh that God would send a terrible hailstorm next. And when the hail began to pour down on Egypt, everything was just destroyed. And all the trees were stripped down, and the animals that were outside were killed. And it just tore up everything. But there was no storm in the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived. So Pharaoh called to Moses again to the palace. I have sinned, Pharaoh said. Please make this terrible storm stop, and I will let God's people go. So Moses prayed, and God stopped the storm. But do you think even then Pharaoh would let God's people go? He did not. As soon as the storm was over, his heart became hard, and he decided to keep his slaves because for him it was really working out. Or was it? I don't think so. But how much longer was Pharaoh going to do this? Well, God sent Moses to Pharaoh again. And he says, God says to let his people go, or he will send swarms of locusts over the land, and it will devour everything in its path. Now, locusts are big, like cricket-like bugs, and they eat on trees. And there was probably not very many trees left after the hailstorm, but here come the swarm of locusts. Pharaoh was too proud to let the slaves go, to let God's people go. And those locusts came in and they stripped everything that had been left, and it was just left bare. There was nothing left. Well, boys and girls, those are the first 8 plagues that I've shared with you. And that is not the end of the story, but that is where we're going to end today. And today I wanted you to remember that God is bigger and that he is stronger than anyone or anything. And that is the principle that I want you to learn today. Now, as far as your assignment goes, I want to give you a challenge to do at home. Now, I'm going to show you, you probably didn't see it, but on my wrist, there's a bracelet. I made a little crafty bracelet. I printed mine on the computer, but you don't have to do that. It says, be strong in the Lord. And so you can either do that or you can just draw some kind of bracelet that reminds you that the Lord is strong, to hide in his strength, because he is strong. Do you think Moses and Aaron could have done any of this on their own? Absolutely not. They were able to talk to Pharaoh, and they had the words to say to Pharaoh because God had given that to them, and God had prepared them and helped them. And it was God that did all of these plagues, and it was in his power, not in Moses's or Aaron's power. Even if Aaron was the one that put his staff places to cause these things, it was still in God's power. So I want you to make a bracelet, and it can be out of paper, or it can even be fancier if you're a crafty person. But something, maybe have it say strength, or maybe have it say be strong in the Lord, like mine says. But you can draw a picture, or you can color it at fancy colors, and then put it on your wrist and take a picture. Your picture that you send me can either just be of your wrist, or it could be of you also. It's up to you. I'm making a collage of all the things that I'm getting, and I haven't put them together yet. I want to have several things. So keep sending me your pictures, and I'm going to put together a collage. All right, boys and girls, I will see you next time.